So I really, really don't do well in front of, behind podiums. I speak with my hands and my body, and so if I feel confined, I might not get my message out here. So today, actually, I have a couple of agenda items. My first goal for you today is that my presentation today will help you see why we need to make some changes in policies in education. And I hope I give you some motivation to do something about it. The second thing is, for those of you who are already choosing alternative education and not really in the system, I hope to give you something that you'll be able to go home with, that you'll be able to really implement into your own homes and the education that your children are experiencing. My presentation today is based on the findings that of my master's thesis. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of background in that. In 2010, I entered into a master's program because I thought it would be really fun to get a master's degree. And that was the same year that Oak kind of got started with his agency-based education. And I love Neil Flinders, so when I saw that he was doing that, I came to that very first meeting, and I'm just saying, Oak was amazing. I came away from that meeting saying, that man, I don't know what he does, but it was beautiful. And we got all these people from so many different walks of life in education coming together and actually talking about what we can do to make a difference. I'm a little bit sad that there aren't more numbers here because I'd like to see the movement grow. I'd like to see something like this get on the road. And go from state to state to state so that people can actually start talking about education. My background is that I started homeschooling when I was 22 years old. My children were babies. And of course, I didn't have a degree and I had no credential, and I really didn't have an education of my own. And my only motivation to get an education was that I had children to raise, which was my perfect motivation, which is actually what I want to talk to you about today a little bit. So you're probably interested in knowing what are the 2 secrets to happy learners. The big question that you might be having in your head is, well, do happy learners matter? Do we really want happy learners? Maybe I just want a learner who's going to sit in their seat and do what I tell them so that I can make sure that they're going to be successful in life. I really want you to examine that question in your head. Do you want happy learners? Or do you want to make sure you have children who are successful in your definition of what success is? Because if you don't care about happy learners, then you probably don't really care about the scientific findings that I have to present for you today. And I'm being a little bit facetious, but it's really true. It's a real question that we have to ask ourselves. Are we setting our children up to be happy, or are we setting them up to just be successful, whatever that means to us? So just keep that in your mind. So when I was writing my thesis, I came up with these 3 questions that I wanted to really find answers to. The first one was, how does emotional health impact learning? And there's a lot of reasons why I asked that question, mainly because I had been working for a mental health clinic at the time that was dealing with a lot of kids with addictions. And I knew that they were having a lot of health issues, and I wanted to know if it was impacting their learning. The second question I asked myself was, should emotional health be an educational concern? Which is the question I said, do we care about happy learners, basically? And then the third question is, if so, then what are the best educational approaches for fostering emotional health? So I'm going to assume that you care about happy learners because that's the direction I'm going to take you today. Let me tell you what some of my findings were. So I first found the book, well, not first, but one of the books that I found is called How Children Succeed by Paul Tough. And Paul Tough really highlighted in his book that they succeed. He found through all of his research that children succeed when they have grit and curiosity. And grit can only be grown when you're motivated, when the children are motivated to grow their own grit. Motivation actually comes from the infusion into the brain of dopamine. And so if we want children who are motivated learners, they have to have dopamine inducing activities in their life. And actually it does, the happiness of their state actually affects the ability for them to have dopamine come into the brain. Curiosity is actually a dopamine inducing emotional state. So if they're curious, they're going to start getting some dopamine, which is a really cool thing. And then how do you create curiosity for children? And again, I'm going to tell you what I found out. And then the other document that I was introduced to was a document by, well, it's a big presentation and it's online, and it's highly available and it's amazing. You should all go home and look it up and read it or listen to it. It's called How the World Learns by Alexander Wiseman, who I think is one of the great thinkers and thought leaders in today's education society. And he introduced me actually to the Coleman Report. For those of you who are not familiar with the Coleman Report, what happened was right after they had that big, huge blow up, Brown versus Board of Education, and all that whole no more equal, separate but equal things are going to work anymore in the United States. Coleman was hired to create a big, huge, he did a big, huge research project and created a big, huge team, and they went out into the United States. They had a huge demographic that they studied, and they came back to Congress and they reported on what they found. And the question they were asking was, well, does separate but equal actually work? Why is it an issue? Is environment so important? Are textbooks that look good as important, as textbooks that don't look good? They wanted to ask all those questions about Brown versus the Board of Education, the findings, well, the Supreme Court opinion about Brown versus Board of Education. And Coleman came back with a very, very interesting conclusion. And he concluded, and his team concluded together, that actually desks and buildings and textbooks did not make the difference in education for kids. What made the difference was culture and the cultural background that they came from. So they introduced the idea of this macro culture that we, this big melting pot of the United States that we have. This macro culture has hundreds, maybe even thousands of microcultures. And it was the microcultures that actually impacted their success, their academic success. So thus came the birth of multiculturalism, because the United States was moving already towards all kinds of state standards and national standards, and they wanted to be able to meet the needs of these microcultures. And because local control was starting to be taken away, especially because of Brown versus the Board of Education, they wanted to say, well, we still care. And so what we're going to do is we're going to teach people, we're going to teach parents, we're going to teach teachers and educators how to be multicultural and teach to the culture. And we're going to actually put that into our standards so that we can have more successful academic learners. And then I want to go on to the next thing that I was stumbled upon was the Tools of the Mind by Vygotsky, the Vygotsky Approach to Education by Elena Bodovra. She outlines in her book the Vygotsky, and Lev Vygotsky spent lots and lots of time to figure out how they can actually reach the child's heart. And what he proposed was that by reaching, what they would do was they would kind of come where the child was, and then they give them these tools to emotionally regulate, so that when they get kind of triggered or upset, they can talk to themselves, or what they use these tools to help them calm themselves down so they can ignite their curiosity again. It was a very interesting approach and idea about how to create emotional health for children in the schools. What I discovered was somebody really actually did care about emotional health. And Vygotsky was far beyond, he was a forerunner in all of that idea. And then I reintroduced myself to Jack Barzin, who is a great scholar and an amazing man, who wrote a book, Teacher in America. And he said one thing. Now, he said a lot of things, actually, but he said one thing that really, really made me believe that I was on the right track in my questioning. He said, in the end, education comes down to one thing: the relationship between the teacher and the student. And that relationship is one of love, one of passion, one of concern, and one of intimacy. And that teacher, if not very mindful of that relationship, can destroy a child and ruin their academic success for life. So there's got to be something there, right? Then I was introduced to teaching reluctant students using motivational interviewing techniques, which is actually how I came up with my thesis, which I brought these for those of you who are interested. I'm just going to give them away for free. They were $6 when I sell them. But this is kind of just a layman's version of the findings of my master's thesis. It's called the Mentor's Handbook. And it is based on the motivational interviewing techniques that were outlined by Anna Jones and Harvey Wells. In this finding, it's a study that they did using motivational interviewing techniques, which is a psychology term for really good mentoring. And they, I'm just saying, had some amazing results. I wish they would have more people interested in what they did. And then the last thing I want to tell you about is this book called Teaching with the Brain in Mind. And that's what my whole presentation is about today, is on what I found in Teaching with the Brain in Mind. This is not actually what I came up with for my thesis, but it's just one of the pieces, one of the very tiny pieces of why I think we need to really think about where education is going today. So I'm going to spend the remainder of my time talking about teaching with the brain in mind. First of all, what we need to understand about the brain, and what you need to understand about the brain, what scientists know about the brain, is that the goal in life, period, is to grow the prefrontal cortex. Because the prefrontal cortex is where all moral decision is made, and where all of our functioning in society actually works. What they also know is that when children are born, their limbic system is the most active part of their brain. The limbic system is is the system that controls all the lower, what they call lower level functionings of the brain. which is the emotional center. It also is responsible for memory and cognition, the limbic system. But the whole point is to be able to train the limbic system so that the emotions don't get out of control. There's this little organ called the amygdala in the limbic system that fires constantly. And it likes to fire fear. It's that fight, flight, or fear mechanism inside of us, and it's constantly firing. And children are highly susceptible to this firing amygdala. And because they're highly susceptible to it, we have to give very nurturing environments for these children so that they can grow their curiosity and begin to make all of the neuronal synapses that they need to make into the prefrontal cortex that will actually help them become functioning people in society. So how do you do that? We know that the prefrontal cortex is responsible for emotional balance. It's responsible for body regulation, for morality, for fear modulation, and it has these 9 functions that we all need to grow into and make the neuronal connection for. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for all of what they call the high order processing. Some people call it the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain. The prefrontal cortex is also where the cerebral activities happen. So while the limbic system is responsible for bringing in all the knowledge, the prefrontal cortex is responsible for translating it. So we have to somehow get it in first and then grow it into a translation. So how do you get it in first? The prefrontal cortex, the limbic system is very stimulated by dopamine, as I said, which is the reward drug. The limbic system also really likes serotonin, which is the calming drug. It also really likes oxytocin, which is the connecting drug. But it's highly susceptible to norepinephrine, which is the fear drug, or the excitement drug, or the aggression drug. Okay? So the idea is, let's do whatever we can to grow the other 3 drugs. I call them drugs, but they're neurotransmitters. Let's do what we can to get those firing and to calm the norepinephrine, which they're highly susceptible to. Because the norepinephrine, if they've getting too much norepinephrine going on, they actually disconnect from the prefrontal cortex, and the neuronal connections aren't going to work. And they're not going to be happy learners. So, I want to just read you a quote from the book, Teaching with the Brain in Mind. All cognition is built from lower order brain systems. It's built there, including all of these things: sensory and motor systems, auditory and language systems, attention and executive functions. It all starts in the limbic system, the downstairs, the brain. Social and emotional systems, downstairs brain. Memory systems, downstairs brain. Behavioral and reward systems, downstairs brain. Remember, our goal is to grow the upstairs brain. It all starts in the downstairs brain. So if we're going to make the neuronal connections, we have to appeal first to the downstairs brain. So let's talk about the downstairs brain for just a minute, or actually let's talk about the brain as a whole. First of all, we have what they call the unique brain. So the unique brain is where culture is assimilated. It's what makes you unique as a person. It also is gender specific, your unique brain. This is also where you kind of see disabilities in that unique brain. That unique brain is kind of you, right? It defines you. And then we have what we call the problem-solving brain. So, like I said, that upstairs brain is connected to the prefrontal cortex, but the problem-solving brain actually is when we connect both of those parts of the brain. So we can't really problem solve until we make those neuronal connections. And then we have the emotional center, or the emotional brain, which is very limbic, but it also, all of our moral choices are kind of emotional choices. So it starts from that limbic center, but it also has to make that neuronal connection to the cortex. So let's talk about the unique brain for just a second. Culture. So in the Coleman Report, they really were trying to address culture, right? Because they could see that it was making a difference. They didn't know back then all the brain studies they know now. But they thought, well, we'll just tell people that culture makes a difference, and so talk about culture. Now they understand that culture is everything. It's not just what makes the difference. Culture is what defines the child. So as a foster parent, I'm going to tell you, I have a very diverse experience in my home with education. I have children of my own who are special needs. I have children of my own who are actually high academic achievers. I have 4.0 students. I have, everything in between, and I have these foster children who have IEPs and who are struggling in every arena of their life. And I'm going to tell you, culture is everything. I have a 12-year-old at home that thinks he can't read, thinks he can't read a clock, thinks he can't, because he's culturally disabled because of all of the drug addiction, all of the abuse, all of the neglect that's gone in his life. I'm going to tell you right now, the kid isn't stupid. He just needs to be immersed in a kind of academic environment that will nurture him and get his limbic, his amygdala stop firing and calm down. He's not going to experience that in a normal school setting. So culture is everything. Gender. There are specific gender things. I'm going to skip a few things because I want to make sure I get to my conclusion here. But so they've done a lot of study on gender, and I think it should be an option for us to have all girls schools and all boys schools. I'm just saying. I think it would be super successful. It used to be that way, actually, but now with our modern ideas about gender, that wouldn't be politically correct. But what they know is that boys are more inclined toward information processing. So they like information and they like processing it. It actually fires the dopamine in their brain. It makes them excited. They're better at hitting targets, and their gross motor skills. And girls are more inclined toward intuitive processing, that feel-good stuff, remembering landmarks and people. And what's interesting is, yes, it probably is saying men are probably better hunters and girls are probably better gatherers. So that's another thing that we have to keep in consideration, because those are the things that fire the dopamine. So you're probably wondering what the 2 secrets are to success, to happy learners. Let me tell you what they are. They're 2 R's: relationship and relevance. Okay, we just started talking about the unique brain. And I told you all the things that makes a person unique. That is actually what's relevant to them. If you cannot reach them at what is relevant to them, they will check out. They won't be happy learners. They'll be robots. Okay, the second one is relationship. So I say relevance is connection to themselves, the novel, and the familiar. So that's the relevant. Relationship is things connecting to other things. I want to read you a little poem. Disconnection, separation, division, detachment, disassociation. Why is it that these are the words that describe the way we view our world and ourselves? We are disconnected from the earth herself, separated from the delicate web she has woven, divided from each other by arbitrary encumbrances, detached from the very meaning of our existence, and disassociated from the awe and mystery of the world and the universe. How is it that man can fly to the moon but cannot free ourselves from war? Disconnection, separation, division, detachment, dissociation comes from subject learning. Another quote from the book, neither context nor cognition can be understood in isolation. That means they have to have hooks in their brain to hook things to make connections with. So let me describe this to you so that you can kind of see it. I'm hoping in your mind you might see something like, let's say, Woodstock. Okay? It's an event. Let's just go there together. Let's think about Woodstock. Now I'm gonna take you on a journey. Okay, Woodstock is an event. Now, event to a place. You think of New York, right? An event, a place to an environment to a geographical zone to plant life, a plant life to ecosystems, ecosystems to communities, communities to culture, culture to social norms to relationships, relationships to connection, connection to common interests to hobbies, hobbies to music, music to pop stars to groupies, groupies to events. I just described Woodstock. But you also learned a lot in between. If you really cared about Woodstock, that's where we would start with you. I want to just share with you a couple of other stories. This is a math story, and this is from the book. Here's a striking example of this phenomenon. The daily use of in-context mathematics by adolescent street vendors in Brazil is impressive. In the range of 98 to 99% accuracy. Yet, in a laboratory setting, their accuracy drops by half, even on tasks that require the same skills. This finding suggests that skills are highly contextual. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up, give you my conclusion here, and then we're going to open up for questions. So, the conclusion that I have for you is that standards actually were created as an accountability movement. So can't we be just accountable to each other? I mean, that was kind of the vision of Horace Mann when he said, let's have these little local school boards that can say, here's what we're going to do, and they can be accountable to the little local school board, which is the cultural center of all of this world that we live in, these microcultural centers. Why can't we just go back to that? I'm going to tell you why. Because you're disconnected from each other. Because you don't love each other. Because you can't get along with each other. Because you disagree. And so you have to say, someone has to moderate for me. Big brother, come moderate me. Stop it. Stop fighting. Get along. We don't need a big brother. We need to love each other. We need to trust each other. We need to let our children be happy learners. They deserve it. And the only way they're going to do that is if you and I get along. And we learn how to get along. And that we grow our prefrontal cortex. And that we make our neuronal connections that we need so that we can fear modulate. It's our problem, not theirs. Thank you.
Okay, if anybody has an immediate question for Aneladee, just go ahead and fire it out. Otherwise, we'll have a little discussion at the table, write down a question or two as a group, and then we'll address those. So, does anybody have a really quick one? Yeah, Joel.
The new ESSA is almost trying to measure school culture and encourage something along like what people are realizing what you're saying. But yet I tremble in fear at thought of other people deciding what's happy learning. I mean, I think what you said at the end is it has to be kind of organic or grown in. I mean, can it come from the state or federal level or even, the Mammoth School District level? How do we foster this?
Well, thank you for asking that question.
Restate it into the microphone.
Okay, so the question is, can this happen on a national or can something like this, creating happy learning, happen on a more macro level? So the Founding Fathers, and I'm a constitutionalist, their great vision was local control. And I think that if we just stick back, ABE is all about principles and sticking to the principles we started on, the principles of democracy. And local control is one of those principles. Why can't we just embrace that? Because now that science proves that's what we need, why don't we just go back to that? It's okay, right? But I'm telling you, it's because we don't get along. Yes, question. Did you have a question here?
Oh, yeah, I understand. So, wouldn't the ultimate control, though, being that family have the autonomy to create their own culture and to be able to choose exactly what they need for their children and to be able to absolutely influence what the experience is? To me, that's the ultimate local control. Horace Mann actually took that away from the parents. They used to have it. He pulled that away and
Yeah, I'm not telling you I disagree or agree with Horace Mann. I'm just telling you that, we can argue that all day, and we are where we are with that. I totally agree with you. We need to take responsibility. So what are you going to do in your home? Are you going to start loving your neighbor? Are you going to start, what are we going to do? The control's been taken away from us because we're not happy learners.